morning and welcome to Rising. As always, we have a great show for you today, and it's Friday, so I'm joined at the desk by Niall Stanage. Niall, what's on your mind today?
Well, it's great to see you, Amber. For a start, we have a lot to get to. Firstly, some notes. We are 9 days since the killing of health insurance executive Brian Thompson in Manhattan, and a lot of people still don't get it. Of course, they are right to be horrified by the murder. Mr. Thompson had a wife and 2 children, and their grief must be unimaginable. But at the same time, a lot of powerful people in business, politics and the media don't want to acknowledge the full extent of public anger at the insurance industry. The sudden eruption of frustration over these past days isn't itself morally wrong or reprehensible. It's completely valid. And that's the thing about anger. It can have righteous roots, even as it can lead to dark places. Not everyone has been willing to recognize that. Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman has naturally been especially vigorous in condemning what he sees as an unseemliness on social media. Fetterman's attacks on posts he considers vile earned him predictable praise from the Wall Street Journal's corporate-friendly editorial board. Quote, shooting a healthcare executive in the back is not a warning of anything other than the illness or evil of one young man, the journal complained. But that's simply not true. The reaction to that event is a warning. A klaxon of public disgust at the state of our healthcare system and at the middlemen who grow rich off its failings and at corporate greed itself. Look again at what we have seen and read online, and you'll find not only expressions of anger, but expressions of pain. People sometimes talked literally about their own physical pain, but more often they talked about heartache, watching someone they love suffer. Often they told stories about how their pain and trauma were multiplied by the callousness of insurance corporations. One social media user posted of being told that her husband's trip to the ER for a heart attack would not be covered by insurance because it was not a medical emergency. Another social media user posted a letter ostensibly from a health insurance company denying a claim for a wheelchair for his son. The son had cerebral palsy. The insurance company held that the wheelchair in question was, quote, not medically necessary. Another viral post showed what appeared to be an irate letter from a doctor to an insurance company. The doctor was furious because the insurer had denied a request for anti-vomiting medication to a child receiving chemotherapy. We've heard a lot these past few days about appropriate responses, but what is the appropriate response to such avarice and cruelty? Is it polite dissent? A rueful shake of the head, maybe a strongly worded email? Or is rage a morally righteous response? That rage should not lead anyone to the deeds allegedly perpetrated by Luigi Mangione, who has been accused of Thompson's murder. Those alleged deeds were wrong. But can we say the same about his words? In the full version of Mangione's manifesto, published by independent journalist Ken Klippenstein, he wrote, quote, a reminder, the US has the #1 most expensive healthcare system in the world, yet we rank roughly number 42 in life expectancy. There's nothing fringe about that complaint. Not at all. According to a February report from KFF, Americans collectively have at least $220 billion in medical debt. Polling from the same group back in 2022 said that almost half of all Americans said they found it very difficult or somewhat difficult to pay their healthcare costs. And one other thing, last year UnitedHealthcare had $281 billion in revenue, according to CNBC. When those are the realities, it should be no surprise that simmering anger has come to the boil among Americans of all ideological stripes. In fact, one of the striking things to me has been how every time we've discussed this topic on Rising, the comments section has filled up with people who declare their own right-of-centre leanings, but express at least some empathy for Mangione's anger. Most of the elected officials willing to say such things have been on the left, mind you. Senator Elizabeth Warren told HuffPost, violence is never the answer, but people can be pushed only so far. Senator Bernie Sanders declared the killing abhorrent in an interview with left-wing news site Jacobin. But Sanders added that the online reaction showed that, quote, many people are furious at the health insurance companies who make huge profits, denying them and their families the health care that they desperately need. And Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said this.
This is not to say that an act of violence is justified, but I think for anyone who is confused or shocked or appalled, they need to understand that people interpret and feel and experience denied claims as an act of violence against them. People go homeless over the financial devastation of a diagnosis that doesn't get addressed, or, you know, the amount that they're going to have to cover with a surprise bill and things like that.
Now, I'm not politically naive. I know a lot of people watching right now might dismiss those politicians because they don't like their broader ideology or their policy prescriptions or maybe even their personalities. But on what they have to say on this single topic, are they wrong? What about Luigi Mangione? He apparently wrote of healthcare companies they, quote, have simply gotten too powerful and they continue to abuse our country for immense profit because the American public has allowed them to get away with it. Is he wrong? We know the answer, don't we? Our media culture right now does badly with complexity and nuance, but the American people are grappling with those things in real time. What happens when the alleged perpetrator of a deed that was wrong acted out of a belief that millions of Americans think are right? It's a hard question, but it's also a healthy one.
All right, interesting nuance on this topic. I hear your point that there have been a lot of people who would consider themselves right-wing who have said, yeah, actually the insurance companies in America have serious problems and it's legitimate and valid to be angry at them. I don't disagree with that at all. I often find, though, when you're doing the murder is bad, but you get into a dangerous place really quickly. And I think what's interesting is seeing Luigi Mangione become sort of this folk hero of populist uprising when the facts that we know so far don't really suggest that to be the case. He was someone who was extraordinarily privileged, came from a very wealthy family, who themselves owned these care homes within the healthcare industry, also 2 country club golf courses and a radio station in Baltimore, Maryland. And new reporting from the investigation has suggested that he was not even insured by UnitedHealthcare, and that he had a Reddit account where he was bragging about the successful results of this back surgery that supposedly left him crippled and in immense pain. So I don't find the idea that he was this folk hero taking on big bad insurance companies to be more compelling than the argument that he was someone with mental illness who had been experimenting with psychedelic drugs that put him in a very dark place.
So it's interesting, the point about his background and the family's relative affluence and all of that. I hear that argument being made, and I think Bret Stephens made it in the New York Times, or someone of
I hate to agree with Bret Stephens.
Sorry to break that news to you,
okay.
Amber. But I mean, I guess my sort of response to that in general is, I mean, this is again not to get into the defense of murder, right? But it is the views that people espouse or advocate or represent that matters more than the background from which they come. People from very affluent backgrounds can make very socialistic arguments if they wish. People from backgrounds that may not be typically aligned with conservative worldviews can come to a conservative point of view. I don't think that we should get into the situation of suggesting that someone's biography, whether it is one of affluence or one of poverty, should render political views invalid. Now, that is a separate point from the sort of elevation of him as a folk hero, and I do think there can be stuff, particularly on social media, that is, I would say, too glib in that respect. And like, look, honestly, some of the stuff about his looks, I'm not completely humorless about. Like, I do see the kind of social media, I don't know, entertainment about that in a way, but like, a man is dead at the same time and he is accused of having killed him. We expect he will plead not guilty. We're always very careful here to use terms like allegedly and so forth, but I do take the point that some of the social media reaction is too flippant. My point was more that the underlying views that were expressed, I think, are very widely shared.
Yeah, and let's get into that a little bit more, because what I find perhaps problematic, I guess you could say, I hate that word though, about this conversation and debate is that it seems like a really drastic oversimplification of the problems ailing America's healthcare industry, right? To say it's a greedy CEO who recently joined the company, 2 years ago, and apparently was actually kind of concerned about the high rate of denials within UnitedHealthcare. Like, he's the villain of the whole story and is somehow explanatory of all of the problems that we have. It just feels like a classic case of pointing the finger at an easy target when there's actually a lot of systemic issues that cause health insurance companies to get so much power and to be able to exercise so much control over the healthcare process. And from the conservative perspective, one of those is Obamacare, which actually encouraged the consolidation of insurance companies through higher regulations, through the standardization of insurance plans, and the requirement that everyone be insured. So especially from the left perspective of this, where they really loved Luigi from the get because of his actions, it's like, okay, but you all support the kind of government regulation that actually helps spur this problem.
Well, although I would say, in defense of what is sometimes known as horseshoe politics, the interview with Bernie Sanders that I quoted from the Jacobin, he actually makes that point within that interview, that Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, actually served to strengthen the position of insurance companies within the system and funnel more money to them. Just on the point, I guess we're going to have to wrap in a second, but I do take the point about systemic problems in all sorts of areas of American life. I think that it would be great if our political debates did address those. Sometimes I think when there's an attack on one thing, people say, well, it's a systemic problem, and that becomes an excuse not to deal with anything at all. You just say, oh, it's systemic, and we'll get to it sometime, and it's never gotten to or addressed. And I think
and that's fair. That's a fair counterpoint. And I guess my response to that would be that it's not meant to spur inaction, but to caution people about justifying or finding beneficial the taking of a target of one individual who, in the grand scheme of things, is really not the villain.
I think I will let you have the last word on that, Amber.
I appreciate
but there's
that. Thank you.
Much more to talk about, plenty more coming on Rising after this. The Department of Justice announced Thursday that there were no undercover FBI agents at the site of the Capitol riot on January the 6th. The report released finds that while the agency should have gathered more information prior to the breach of the Capitol, there were no FBI employees authorized to be there. Now, that finding goes a long way to debunking a conspiracy theory claiming that the FBI consciously helped provoke the events that day. The findings also offer a mixed assessment of the FBI's performance in the run-up to the riot. It revealed that the agency failed to canvass informants across all 56 of the Bureau's field offices for relevant intel. That intelligence, the report admits, quote, could have helped the FBI and its law enforcement partners with their preparations in advance of January the 6th. Now, here's an important point. The DOJ did find that 26 informants were in Washington that day for election protest-related purposes. And 4 of them did go into the Capitol building, having not been authorized by the FBI to do so.
Outgoing FBI Director Christopher Wray has defended the agency's handling of events and told a congressional panel last year during a hearing that the suggestion that J6 operation was orchestrated by FBI agents is, quote, ludicrous.
This is an interesting story, Amber, because to my mind, it's not really a cut and dried issue. There is a lot of complexity to this. I do think that if people were saying, and you may of course disagree with this, but to my mind, if people were saying, look, the FBI kind of instigated or incited this report from the Office of the Inspector General pushes back very hard against that. The question, I think, arises, as it often does with the use of informants within, what would we say, subversive or potentially subversive organizations, as to what their role is, what they are permitted to do and not to do, the extent to which they do things to maintain a credible cover, which are then, obviously seen in an understandably negative light. So we do have the more than 20 informants in and around the Capitol, but not the classic sense of someone from the FBI being told, you go and infiltrate the Proud Boys or infiltrate the Oath Keepers or whatever, and then lead a riot. Though that seems to me the key distinction here, but what do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that there's a little bit of revisionist history and gaslighting going on here with the mainstream media kind of massaging the actual claims that were made by people suspicious of the FBI's potential involvement, for lack of a better term, on January 6th into being this very explicit that FBI paid agents were there to encourage people to go into the Capitol. And you're right to say it was a lot more nuanced than that, and a lot of people were pointing at the informants as opposed to FBI undercover agents. One of the people who got the most attention was Ray Epps, who was filmed the day before January 6th, yelling that people should go into the Capitol the next day, on the day of apparently doing the same thing, and then not receiving similar charges as some of the other people who had gone into the Capitol and not even been on video encouraging other people to do so, until a lot of pressure eventually forced the FBI's hand. I think they gave them like a couple of months or something or other, but certainly a lot lesser of a sentence than other defendants with similar charges against them. So the question was, okay, well, was he connected to the FBI or an informant in some way such that they would not want to give him such a heavy penalty, but felt like they had to do something in order to keep his cover intact? And now we know that there were 26 individuals there who were confidential human sources or informants for the FBI. And it does raise this question that you're talking about of what lengths do you go to protect a CHS versus if you have 26 individuals who are high level in some of these organizations like the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers who were kind of instrumental in leading the charge on January 6th, do you have some kind of obligation to have them change the views of their organization or push back or even not be there that day to help kind of prevent this event from happening in the first place? Because it goes back to this idea of what good is having all of these informants if you couldn't stop what the FBI views as an insurrection from taking place.
So, I mean, I should say, to be clear, that I also view it as an insurrection, but to the point about the use of those informants, the report argues or claims to have found that the information from those informants was not drastically different from the information that was already publicly available. And they cite, for example, in some instances, claims or calls that were made by a very senior figure in the Oath Keepers in a public, I believe on a website, certainly in some manner of online form that wasn't like a telegram message. It was very openly claiming that they were going to go to Washington and defend then President Trump from what they saw as a coup and all of that. But I think one of the difficulties in any of these debates is you're inevitably in a bit of a hall of mirrors where you are dependent upon the intelligence services generally telling the truth about things where they often have a vested interest, not to be entirely truthful, right? I mean, we don't know, for example, whether any of these informants remain informants and remain members of some of these organizations. And presumably the FBI has valid reasons, actually, for not wanting to say, well, it's you know, this named person and that named person, and perhaps reasons to downplay their role. I do get back to the thing that, I mean, it does seem to me that there were claims made that the FBI had sort of provoked, or the intelligence services in some way had provoked the whole thing, and that seems obviously not true to me.
I also question whether or not the FBI at this point is telling the truth about employees or agents being there that day, because it took us this long to even get the number of informants who were there after they did dismiss that whole general idea that there were people connected to the FBI at the riot that day. So I just have a hard time finding them to be particularly trustworthy. I mean, this is the same organization that had run this kidnapping scheme against the Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer and essentially entrapped American citizens, lay people, into going along with this idea that was completely concocted by a majority of the group, which was undercover FBI agents. And at the same time, as we're looking at the number of informants they had, I mean, they can make the claim maybe that they were just operating off of public information, these informants, but what about the Telegram messages or group chats that they were supposedly a part of that were used in the prosecution? The FBI didn't have, tips on any of that from these informants when they knew that this was going to be a chaotic day, and yet the Capitol wasn't properly fortified. It just seems like a total failure on behalf of our intelligence service.
Well, and to the point about, I would say one of the less contentious but nonetheless very serious failures is just the thing that the report does expose or own up to, which is that there were some of these CHS's confidential human sources in contact with various FBI field offices around the country, but there does not appear to have been a concerted effort to bring all of those different sources together, which I think would have changed the equation a bit, because you would have gone from, okay, we have somebody in Oregon, for the sake of argument, saying that one thing might happen, but then you have like 20 or 25 or 26 of those reports coming in from 2 different field offices around the country. And had those been brought together in a more concrete and organized way, I think the nature of the threat may have been more clearly apparent.
That seems to be a common problem with the FBI as well, where they get tips to field offices that don't make their way to the National Bureau. I mean, we see this with mass shootings, right, where people are turned in or reported by family members or friends who are concerned about them, and they're never run through NICS, or they're never followed up on by because the field office just takes the complaint and kind of files it away somewhere. So that does seem to be a bigger problem in the agency. Absolutely.
So good conversation. There will be, I think, a lot more debate about that particular topic, but we will move on to other topics coming back right after this.
Tech billionaires Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos want in on the Trump train. Both men have reportedly donated $1 million to President-elect Donald Trump's inaugural fund.
Now, you may be sitting on the couch scratching your head as to why they would do that now. And the answer seems to be simple, which is access. Meta, which came under fire for its content moderation policies back in 2020, has eased up. In early December, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram admitted that error rates are too high when enforcing content moderation policies. They pledged to improve their policy rollouts. The company's president of global affairs, Nick Clegg, said the policies get in the way of freedom of expression. He later told reporters he regrets the large amount of COVID-19 related content it removed from the platform.
Here's where things get even more interesting. Recently, conservative commentator Ashley St. Clair claimed that Meta is, quote, actively censoring conservatives right now. Elon Musk responded, concerning. Just weeks before the election, Bezos was criticized for not allowing the Washington Post editorial board to endorse a presidential candidate. Critics saw the move to stop endorsing presidential candidates as an attempt by Bezos to curry favor with Trump in the event that Trump would win a second term.
Well now, quite a bit here in terms of both the tech world and its content moderation policies, which is one element of this story, and then just the currying favor with Trump, which is a second one. I think in the case of Jeff Bezos, for example, it is pretty obvious that he is making nice with Trump. We could argue about the rights and wrongs of it. The furor about the Washington Post endorsement, I thought, reflected very badly on Bezos and his stewardship of the Post. Not because I think the Washington Post needs to make an endorsement, but I think leaving it until the very last minute. If they wanted to stop endorsements, they should have announced that at an earlier stage. And so that, coupled with various other things, just seems like a kind of cozying up to power. And similarly, you could make a broadly similar argument in Mark Zuckerberg's case. But what do you make of it all, Amber?
Yeah, I tend to agree that the Bezos move was obviously opportunistic. I don't think anyone believes he's had some massive political conversion over the past year. I mean, him and Trump had a very notably acrimonious relationship during his first term. Trump would constantly tweet about the Bezos, Amazon, Washington Post, and would threaten regulation or to come after him, et cetera, and Bezos would respond in kind. But the Zuckerberg question is a little bit different, I would say, because as skeptical as I am of his intentions as well, his political sea change appears to go back a little bit further, according to people who are relatively close to Zuckerberg. They say he's always had a little bit of a libertarian streak. He's never been a card-carrying, Democrat, although he did spend $400 million in the last presidential election for voting rights, policies.
For the public good of allowing people to vote more.
Only help Democrats, but sure. So I'm not sure how much I buy that he's always been a libertarian. But I will note the past few years, every 4th of July, he puts out this video of him surfing, and he has an American flag, and he's drinking a beer, and he's clearly trying to clean up the perception that Meta is a company that is biased against conservatives, which I would argue it is, but that's probably a different debate. And before the election even, he comes out and praises Trump after the assassination attempt. Then he dumps $1 million into the inaugural fund. So I guess the bottom line here is my view on this is that they're both opportunistic, but maybe Zuckerberg about 1% to 2% less.
You're being generous. No, I don't really disagree with that. I mean, I think that Zuckerberg has. I think a point that you made that I think is really worth highlighting is the idea that Zuckerberg's evolution, even if it has a large measure of opportunism attached to it, does seem to have taken place over a longer period of time. And I do think that there have been some, to my mind, genuine grapplings with the issues around how do you crack down or dilute misinformation versus how do you stop that from toppling over into an overly censorious kind of approach. And I think that's part of it. Now, I do think it is also important, and here's where I would probably put the stress a little bit differently to you. Some of the comments that Trump has made, in Zuckerberg's case, outright threatening these people, suggesting that if the conduct in the election just passed had been the same as in the 2020 election, that Zuckerberg would have been thrown in jail if Trump won, and language like that. That seems to me one of those examples where Trump is able to say things and be met in some part with a kind of shoulder shrugging that if any other politician said it, it would be a massive firestorm about authoritarian leanings and all of that.
Maybe so. I do think that the context of Trump in general and the way he uses language as a tool to negotiate is important here. He very much says the extreme in the hopes of getting somewhere in the middle. And I think when you approach it from that perspective and know that about him and his style, it does dampen the idea that he's some authoritarian, particularly since during the first term he did not follow through on any of the supposed threats he made about Hillary Clinton being thrown in jail, right? During that debate between them, she said, I hope you never get power. And he said, yeah, because you'd be in jail. And then completely abandoned anything related to the email scandal when he actually got into office. And he said recently in his NBC interview with Kristen Welker that he wants to be a uniter, that he has respect for every person, even if they didn't vote for him. And I do think this is a fundamental difference between the way Trump talks about politics versus the way a lot of other politicians talk about it, which is that Trump attacks his opponents, but never really the voters. You don't hear him really talk about Democratic voters in the same condescending, elitist, nasty way that a lot of Democrats talk about Republican voters.
I'm just thinking about that, whether that is true or not. It is true, I think, that he doesn't generally condemn Democratic voters. He has said those very controversial things, about black voters, what the hell do you have to lose, and so forth, which I think some people have taken as patronizing to black people. But I suppose where I differ from you, Amber, is that I see the point that you make about, well, he uses it as a negotiating position. But isn't the use of the language itself coarsening of our politics, in the sense that if candidates just go around all the time threatening to lock up the other person, then that in itself is damaging, even if the other person ends up not being locked up.
It just feels hypocritical, though, with the left having gone after Trump for the past 3 years, right? I mean, with the number of indictments that they've lobbied against him, a lot of them frankly, in very ridiculous cases that would have never been brought against anyone else. I mean, the fraud case in Manhattan seems an obvious one to me, where they somehow evaluate Mar-a-Lago at $18 million when it's this huge beachfront resort where the land alone is worth $18 million. It just feels kind of rich that Democrats and the left are like, oh my gosh, Trump's going to use lawfare against us. Y'all have been doing this for the past 3 years. I mean, where do you really get off accusing Trump of being the fascist or the authoritarian? And I take your point about the language. I don't like the idea of America being a country like so many in Africa, where as soon as the person in power leaves office, they get thrown in jail for 8 years, and then vice versa. But it feels like we've already crossed that into that Rubicon, so to speak. And I also think that sometimes when Trump talks about throwing people in jail, it's because they've done things that are illegal. I don't know whether or not that's the case with Mark Zuckerberg's election spending, but when you're talking about people at the DOJ who signed off on FISA warrants with false information to spy on members of the Trump campaign, people who were perjuring themselves in front of Congress about whether or not they were funding gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. If you committed a crime and you're a public official and you hurt the American people by doing that, then I don't have any problem with Trump saying that they should go to jail.
I mean, I think we just disagree on this. We've been told to wrap, but briefly, I think I do have problems with the New York fraud case. I do think that any citizen who did what Trump did in the Mar-a-Lago case would be done for obstruction of justice. Like, I think it was obstruction of justice on its face, but I have now talked over you for the last word, which I didn't mean to do.
No,
We'll give Andy the last word next time around. New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is getting support from an unlikely source in her bid to become the top Democrat on the House Oversight Committee.
I want to ask you about AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, announcing her bid for the top Democrat spot on your committee. What are your thoughts? Would you like to co-chair with her?
I'm a big AOC fan. Obviously, I don't agree with very much of her policy, but I think she's a good person. I think she's very well spoken. I did not have a good relationship with Jamie Raskin. I don't think that's any secret.
You heard right. That is indeed House Oversight Committee Chairman, Republican James Comer, backing the New Yorker. AOC is running to replace Maryland Representative Jamie Raskin, who has served as the ranking committee member on the Oversight panel for the past 2 years.
It seems like the fireworks fizzled for Democrats, though, on another committee. New York Representative Jerry Nadler announced Wednesday that he is dropping his bid to remain the top Democrat on the House Judiciary Committee and is instead throwing his support behind, you guessed it, Jamie Raskin.
Now, these are powerful positions. The Judiciary Committee conducts oversight of the executive branch and the federal judiciary. It also has the authority to impeach federal officials, including the president. Well, I think, to be clear, it has the capacity to move impeachment articles before any constitutional lawyers in our audience take exception to how we exactly phrase that. But, well, I want to hear your views on all of this. To me, one of the most interesting strands in what we've just talked about is AOC's move to become, I would say, less of an outside figure within the Democratic Party and within Democratic politics. When she was first elected, she was, for example, really quite antagonistic toward Nancy Pelosi, who was then Speaker. There was, if I recall correctly, a sit-in in Pelosi's office over the Green New Deal, which AOC was very supportive of. Now, she is still obviously a figure of the left, although she has drawn some more frustration from people on what I would, I guess, term the hard left in recent months. She's obviously positioning herself more as a sort of progressive, but within the mainstream of the party, and I find that interesting.
Yeah, I think that's true, and there was a lot of criticism, as you said, from really hardcore progressives of her first couple of years in Congress because they felt like she had betrayed them a bit by voting along party lines on some issues that maybe wouldn't have been as obvious from the way that she ran her campaign. But then you hear rumors that she's considering a 2028 presidential run, and it kind of starts to make sense. Maybe she is more interested in power than she lets on when she's talking about being the sort of progressive populist voice of the left. And these comments from James Comer are not all that surprising to me. People who have met AOC and who work with her say that she's very pleasant. She's relatively easy to work with. She is someone that you like to have a glass of wine with, even if you don't agree with her policy positions, and I think that's fine.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I hope you're now not just like incinerated in the comments for saying something nice about AOC from the right-leaning.
I'd get a drink with her.
No, absolutely. I mean, even among media members, I think she is generally seen in quite a positive light as a person. Like, she resembles a real human being, and she's quite, friendly and solicitous of people and all of that. So that, to my mind, is an interesting part of this. I guess the other broader topic, firstly, like, credit to James Comer for actually saying those things about her, which was, they were constructive things to say. The other big part of this is sort of what the Democrats do in the wake of having lost the presidential election and lost control of the Senate and failing to regain control of the House, a unified Republican government that is causing all sorts of soul-searching among Democrats, many who argue that there needs to be really significant change, that the party is losing working-class voters, that it's out of step with those sensibilities. And then I've also seen, people making counter-arguments about that. Hakeem Jeffries in this week was talking about how below the presidential level, the Democratic Party had actually fared quite well in a number of the battleground states, and he was contending that it is important not to exaggerate the changes that need to happen. That's too long a debate to get into without letting you have your say, because I thought you looked skeptical about the Hakeem Jeffries argument. Go for
There's a lot of reasons to take issue with that, not least of which is that with the way that congressional districts are currently mapped out, it is difficult for Republicans to perform much better than they did in this election. So I think looking at the pure seat differential doesn't really tell the whole story that Hakeem Jeffries would like it to tell. But you're right. This is going to be interesting to see how they operate in Congress post a pretty crushing defeat, especially when we look at these two races for these top committee positions, right? Because you have Jamie Raskin, who's part of the sort of Democratic establishment, simply moving over from one powerful committee to another, but then you have a potential somewhat of a disruptor, even though, AOC has kind of towed the party line and been more friendly to leadership than she had the people suspected she would have been in the past. She still is more progressive than the average Democrat. Her lobbying for the oversight position would be a new change in the Democratic Party.
And sorry, but a generational change also,
exactly.
Which I think is part of the importance.
A generational change, which I think matters. But all of that being said, most common conceptions of what went wrong with the election was that the Democrats went too far left.
Yeah.
So, okay, you have a younger progressive person, but is that really getting to the heart of why Democrats underperformed?
So what I would say about that is sometimes when I look at the election, I think it is a little too overgeneral to cast it entirely in left, right, or left versus centre-left terms, because people like Bernie Sanders, for example, would make the argument that the problem isn't exactly defined in that way. It's that economic left-wing policies were not prominent enough. And I think by implication, at least, Sanders would suggest identity-led politics of the left or of a progressive nature was too prominent. So then you get into these issues of, particularly the trans rights issue, which you and I have talked about before, as being a political loser, not only because lots of people don't agree with the most assertive element of the pro-trans rights community, but also because those debates detract from, increasing the minimum wage or greater labour protections or things that speak more directly to working class voters.
The only problem with his assessment, though, is that in the current Democratic Party, you can't separate economic left from cultural left to any significant degree. Even Bernie Sanders, who wants to get away from identity politics, is completely opposed to the American majority on things like immigration and crime. So I'm just not sure that I buy that those two things can be separated with who the Democratic Party currently has as their standard bearer progressives.
I think this is the argument that I think even some in the more well, again, we're getting into that center-left kind of terminology, but there is an argument that the Democratic Party has become increasingly dominated by very affluent, very socially progressive or left-wing white people, essentially. Well, not only white people, but predominantly. And therefore, it has got distanced from a more non-college going working class element that had at one time been the bedrock of the Democratic Party. And I think that the argument is not necessarily the abandonment of one over the other, but where the emphasis falls. And certainly, I mean, the Trump people would tell you that one of their most effective ads was the ad against Kamala Harris on the trans issue about Kamala Harris is for they, them, Donald Trump is for you, or words to that effect. And so I think that is a genuine part of this whole debate.
Okay.
Well, there we go. Half in agreement, half not. The way we like it here on Rising. More topics after this.
We're following on some breaking news this morning as Crystal Magnum, the woman who accused 3 Duke lacrosse players of raping her in 2006, has confessed that she lied. In an interview from a North Carolina prison where Magnum is serving time for an unrelated second-degree murder conviction, admitted to lying about players sexually assaulting her at a team party where she was working as a stripper.
She continued to make the false claims in her 2008 memoir after the case was thrown out against the players in 2007. Magnum now says that she, quote, made up a story that wasn't true because I wanted validation from people and not from God. I hope that they can forgive me. This was a very famous case for our very youngest viewers. It is hard to perhaps emphasize just what a big deal this was. It was a case that sort of took over a large swathe of the American media when it first happened, in part because it seemed to fit into a very emblematic picture of American life for a while. You had these 3 white lacrosse players who were from very affluent backgrounds. You had this impoverished, troubled woman who was working as a stripper, and she accused them of rape. And then that all fell apart, and there were various reasons why it fell apart, including DNA evidence, or rather a lack of DNA evidence to suggest guilt and all of that. I remember this case very vividly because I had only been in the US about less than 3 years at the time, and I remember going to Durham to report on this, and there was so much going on around the case itself. You know, there's a whole other subtext about tensions between the city of Durham and Duke University and all of that. I tend to see it as a very tragic case all around, but obviously you should not make false allegations of rape. I guess Crystal Magnum deserves some level of credit for now fessing up and seeking forgiveness for it, but there we go.
Yeah, this is a mess, and I think, you know, people who have followed the case and read a lot of the details are not probably super surprised by this. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of misconduct by the prosecutor in this case, who hid from the defense multiple elements of the DNA testing that appeared to exonerate the members of the Duke lacrosse team because their DNA was not found on Crystal, although several other men's was. There, from my memory, I was 13 at the time, but I have gone back and done plenty of research on the case since, as a precursor to the Me Too movement. The testing that was completed in regards to the sexual assault, I believe, did not really suggest that she was beaten or sexually assaulted in the way that she claimed. And then there were also a lot of other inconsistencies with changing the number of men who raped her, what time the rapes allegedly occurred, just all kinds of issues with the story from the get. But I remember seeing this on TV constantly when I was, 13 years old, and noticing the almost glee and joy and gloating of commentators who really did put this case in the framework of a black versus white, low income versus wealthy kind of intra-class racial struggle, as opposed to looking at what the facts of the case actually were. These Duke lacrosse players were eventually awarded, I believe, in a civil suit with tens of millions of dollars, which is as it should be. Their reputations were absolutely destroyed for years while this case played out. And still afterwards, I mean, even if the case is dropped, people hear the initial accusation and if they're not following all the way through to the end, your name is still attached to that for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
I'm glad that, she eventually came forward and gave them the ability to say she said that she made it all up as opposed to just the case fell apart. But I'll refrain from saying much else about her because I think what she did was so heinous to these boys.
I think that I think this is basically the situation, of course, is A, you shouldn't make false allegations, and B, there was obvious prosecutorial misconduct involved here, and Mike Nifong, the prosecutor involved, was in fact disbarred at one point for the various misdeeds that you talk about. So, I mean, I think there was, as I recall it at that time, a rush to judgment, to use a cliche, about the idea that obviously these guys were, essentially rich white kids who had taken advantage of this poor black woman. And it had become part of this narrative. I mean, even the fact that they were lacrosse players, and that is a sport that is very much associated.
It's fratty. It's upper white class.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All of that stuff became part of the mix. And then it emerged, over time, that the facts simply didn't match the allegations. I just felt, yes, what she did was heinous in the sense of make a false allegation of that gravity. It does not excuse it, but just to say it, that she came from a very dysfunctional background. My memory is there was some suggestion of sort of mental troubles as well, or mental unwellness. Of course, that doesn't justify accusing people of things that they didn't do. And then she went on in 2013 to be convicted of second-degree murder in the stabbing death of a then boyfriend or ex-boyfriend. Just a mess all round, and no winners from it. And I mean, it is, I guess, rather belated at this point, 18 years on, to then be saying, yeah, sorry, I made that up.
Exactly. It's not enough, I think, in any sense of the word. And I also, of course, view this, as I mentioned, in the framework of the Me Too movement, which came much later. Really, 2019, I guess, was when that kind of kicked off in response to the Harvey Weinstein allegations, and then kind of ran rampant. But it seems like, despite how bombastic this case was, despite how many issues there were with it, despite the eventual exoneration of the accused, Americans didn't really learn a whole lot from this. It wasn't that much later, just about 10 years or so, that we had the Rolling Stone running with this fantastical UVA rape story, that we have Babe.net running the Aziz Ansari bad hookup story, and so many other similar stories that only serve to undercut and make it more difficult for legitimate accusers to get justice for the crimes committed against them. And there was this mantra that was put out during the Me Too movement of believe all women. And no, sorry, that's not how it works. You don't get a free pass because of your gender. I understand the underlying sentiment that it is difficult for women who have been sexually assaulted to come forward, that sometimes they aren't believed, and that it's often a he said, she said. But that doesn't mean we throw out the entire idea of innocent until proven guilty in the underpinnings of our justice system, because one innocent person going to jail or having their life destroyed is one person too many. And our system is designed to minimize the number of people who are not guilty, who are innocent, who face consequences wrongly for their actions. We always err on the side of the accused being innocent until proven guilty. And we just tried to completely dispense with that notion during the Me Too movement, and I find that to be so problematic.
The Believe All Women slogan was one of those slogans that was bad because it had to be explained, and that's never good in a slogan. If you took that at face value, like defund the police, which was the social justice equivalent, it's wrong, right? You shouldn't either remove all funding from the police or believe all women, regardless of whether there is any corroborating evidence or counter evidence or all of that. The Believe All Women thing, as I understand it, emanated from the better justified belief that when women made complaints, the default was often to disbelieve them, or to say, well, didn't you do anything to bring this upon yourself, or to jump to the conclusion that a encounter that a woman was saying was not consensual, in fact was consensual. And so there was a desire, I think, to offer a corrective to that social pattern. The problem is when that does go too far, and when people are believed making false allegations, obviously that perpetuates its own injustice. That's, I think, where it comes from. I am in the tricky position of mostly agreeing with you, but being more sympathetic to the injustices that give rise to those kind of slogans in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the pendulum just swung way too far in the other direction. And and a fun story about this, I don't know how fun it is, but a story nonetheless. I gave a speech at American University to the Young Americans for Liberty group during the height of this slogan, and titled my talk, "No, Don't Believe All Women," which was meant to, of course, be a little bit provocative, but also to serve as a counterbalance to what was the prevailing narrative at the time. And in my speech, I talked a lot about the history of innocent black men getting dogged by accusations of sexual assault as a form of weaponization. And as I was talking about cases like Emmett Till, I heard people outside of the room chanting, "Believe all women." And I just found that dichotomy to be a fundamental part of the problem of how we talk about sexual assault and our justice system in this country. And I'm glad that we've sort of left that whole hashtag movement in the dustbin.
Yeah, and hopefully move to a more nuanced and more realistic position on all of those difficult topics. We will have more topics, perhaps a couple of lighter topics to talk about on Rising right after this.
Well, Google is out with a new Christmas ad that features a non-binary beauty influencer. The online ad for Google Shopping depicts TikTok star Cyrus Vesi searching for skincare products. Let's take a look.
So dry. This winter dryness is not it, especially when I have so many holiday looks to pull off. Thankfully, I know just the thing. And it's in stock nearby. Hydrated skin is a gift to everyone. No wrapping needed. Happy holidays to me.
The ad drew backlash online, with conservative commentator Ollie London sharing it on X, writing, "Google launches woke Christmas campaign featuring man wearing women's clothing complaining about his skin." Writer for Red State Bonchi writes, "Google, what should we do for our Christmas ad? Normals? Maybe a family sharing gifts around a tree?" Google, sorry, best we can do is a dude prancing around in women's clothing.
A Google spokesperson told Fox News, quote, "Everyone likes to find a good deal and save money. That's why we're promoting Google Shopping as the best way to do that." To put it in perspective, this was a single sponsored Instagram post representing a fraction of a percent of a much wider Google Shopping campaign. So look, I always cringe a bit about stories like this. I find them hard to get outraged about. I know cultural warriors, particularly if the online persuasion, do. It's one ad, it features a trans person. I don't know, is it good, is it bad? If you don't like it, turn it off, whatever.
This is the first I've actually seen the ad, so
Yeah.
This is a genuine reaction. Did I find it weird? Of course. Is it going to stop me from using Google? I suppose not.
Right.
Am I outraged about it? No, I don't really feel outraged. It just kind of was like a raise my eyebrows and cringe kind of moment. But I do think brands should be wary of the fact that there has been a cultural backlash to this type of catering to a very small percentage of the American people. And a lot of people do find it distasteful and weird, and that could influence their shopping habits. We saw similar backlash against Bud Light and Target for Bud Light for the ad featuring transgender influencer Dylan Mulvaney, and then Target for featuring pride displays in the children's section. And there was a significant portion, as we talked about earlier in the show, of the recent election that was about cultural issues and the public's reaction to what they viewed as the overwokening of society. So I would just caution Google to kind of see where your audience is at, because I don't think this is it.
Yeah, I think that corporations are now trying to play a difficult game in that on one hand they're trying to appeal to progressive younger people in particular, and trying to get for themselves an image of coolness or progressiveness or whatever it is. One of the other conversations you and I had on a previous occasion was about Jaguar, which you pronounce in some different way to me.
I love the way you say it, way more than the way I say it.
But in any event, the car company, which had this very woke, different kind of ad for a brand that had, I think, previously been considered affluent, but sort of stolid and not that exciting, really. And so there's this attempt sometimes to generate excitement or coolness or hipness of things that turn out to create significant blowback. To me, I mean, I guess on one level, maybe you could argue, well, it gets controversy and controversy attracts attention and attention gets the brand name out there. But I just wonder at the cultural moment we're in, whether that in fact works. What I just said happens, but then there's the counter reaction, which tends to be much more negative, and you alienate at least as many people, it seems to me, as you enthuse.
Which is a relatively new phenomenon, because conservatives historically have not been very good at boycotts, and I think part of that is because they viewed it as a losing battle when they believe that institutions in general have been almost wholly captured by the left. Well, I have to buy products somewhere, or I have to watch movies, or I have to consume TV products, etc. Now when they see the power of the Bud Light boycott, they think, okay, well actually we are a significant portion of the shopping base in America that corporate America has to rely on to buy their goods, and we can now exercise enough influence for our voices to actually be heard in this process. And some companies are listening and some aren't, including Jaguar or Jaguar.
Love it.
But I think the danger too with companies trying to do this sort of edgy, young, hip, woke thing is that when every company is doing it, it actually becomes a signal that you're not cool or hip or woke,
right,
and actually becomes quite exhausting and tiresome. And at the same time, we've seen a lot of companies move away from this kind of advertising. You've also seen them move away from diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. Companies like John Deere, Walmart, etc., all falling to online backlash about their DEI policies and complaints from employees. University of Michigan, we talked about recently, has been pulling away from DEI policies as well. And there's a significant, I think, grassroots movement against a lot of the hyper-focus on race and identity that finally people up top are starting to hear.
Yeah, and to that point, and to the cultural and media dimensions of that as well, it is interesting that there are a number of people in the media space, Joe Rogan being the most prominent and obvious example, where they have enormous popularity that skews toward at least younger people, that is founded partly in this idea that the woke and liberal and progressive side has become the kind of establishment side, and the outlaw side is the one fighting against that. That mentality doesn't seem to be reflected too much in these advertising campaigns, which seem to be a lot more doubling down on the ultra progressive kind of imagery. And I wonder whether it really is wise, because I'm not at all sure that it is capturing the zeitgeist, as advertisers love to say. I wonder if the zeitgeist is in fact a bit more different and a bit more reactionary. I don't mean that as a negative label, but a reaction against that stuff.
Well, sure. I mean, if you look at TikTok trends over the past couple of years, it's kind of gone from the queer, non-binary, talking about your self-diagnosed mental illness, to the very opposite end of the spectrum, which is the trad wife, runs the farm, walks around barefoot kind of aesthetic, and the latter seems to be much more popular nowadays. Yeah. And companies are always slow to react to trends, I think, though. So we'll see if maybe Google realizes that they might have stepped in it a little bit here. But we're going to cover a lot more, obviously, on Rising today, so stay tuned. We'll be right back.
The future of the Department of Education is still uncertain, but schools are now stepping up to the plate. The burdens of student debt have reached a boiling point, and now schools are taking more steps to make college less expensive. Their solution? Well, some colleges will now be offering free tuition to middle-class families.
Starting in the fall of 2025, students will receive free full tuition at Brandeis University, the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and Carnegie Mellon University if their family makes less than $75,000 per year. And students at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the University of Pennsylvania will have no tuition if their family earns $200,000 or less per year.
The news has been welcomed by most students, but also complained about by others. The MIT student body president said some students called the changes middle-class killers, arguing they're painful to some students who are too poor to pay the full tuition, but too wealthy to qualify for financial aid.
But some students may still be breathing a sigh of relief after President Biden's student debt forgiveness plan was shot down by the Supreme Court.
Okay, Amber, I think you need to take this one because I'm predictably in favour of forgiving less well-off people student tuition or broadening the net. But I imagine you have more mixed feelings, perhaps.
Well, I'm generally fine if this is what colleges want to do and it's not a federal subsidized program, which ultimately leads to further tuition hikes down the road. If the college has enough money in their coffers and their endowment to do this, I think that's perfectly well. The point that student body president at MIT was making is, I think, a valid one, because a lot of what happens with the current college funding landscape is we often talk about the impact on low-income students, but typically they're actually the ones paying the least for college because they qualify for some kind of federal financial aid, and then they usually can get either a merit or need-based scholarship from the college that they're applying to. A lot of the Ivy League universities, for example, are need-blind admissions, meaning they don't consider your ability to pay the full cost of tuition when deciding whether or not to admit you, and then they have a pledge to cover your full demonstrated need as well through a combination of federal and university-based aid. So that's great. Those students are generally pretty well covered. I speak from experience. I was a low-income first-generation college student at Georgetown, so I've been through this process and this whole song and dance. I ended up graduating with $10,000 in student loan debt, thanks to the generosity of taxpayers and Georgetown. But what happens is the people who are wealthy can generally pay the full cost of tuition, which can end up being $200,000 to $300,000 throughout an entire college career based on sticker price if you're going to one of those top tier universities. But that middle group of students whose parents are slightly above the necessary income for which to qualify for financial aid, but below that much higher number that you actually need to be able to cash flow tuition every year, kind of get stuck with no choice but to take out those massive amounts of student loans. So it's typically actually upper middle class students who end up having the most student loan debt because their parents can't afford the full cost of going to school and they're not really getting any benefit from the government or from the school itself. Should they be covered more? I mean, that's a legitimate debate to have because it's not like they're floundering in the lower class or below the poverty line like some of the other students who really do need the assistance are. But I think it's a worthy conversation to have because I do think that's where most of the student loan debt is actually coming from, is that middle group.
So I start from the very uncontroversial position that the cost of university or college education in this country is just absurd.
Absolutely. We agree on that 100%.
I mean, as someone who went through college on the other side of the Atlantic, the figures just make my eyes spin. And not only for Ivy League type institutions, but basically any four-year private college or whenever you're not paying at least in-state tuition rates at the very least. Robbie and I were talking earlier this week about the degree to which administration has sort of bloomed within colleges, enormous amounts of money being spent on people who are not directly teaching students, nor necessarily on improving the facilities for students themselves, but in this sort of administrative class within the college bureaucracy, and that's ridiculous. I do think that some of these colleges, though, because of how high they are setting the income bands, may actually be addressing some of the problem that you're talking about. Yeah. While some were at a $75,000 level, it was MIT and University of Pennsylvania families earning under $200,000.
Yeah.
I mean, that, you're not doing badly if your family's earning $200,000. Sure. So that element of it is perhaps being addressed. How we deal with the fundamentals of the cost of college and how to curb that apparently inexorably rising graph, I have no great ideas on.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The $200,000 number does further address that middle group more than the $75,000 number. Not to say that, $75,000 is anything to scoff at either, but it's certainly not, with inflation and the tuition rates, gonna really get you a long way to help you to pay for 4 years of school. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't address the fundamental problems of rising tuition every year, of the student loan debt crisis, for, again, that middle to upper middle income group. And we just, unfortunately, on the federal level, think that further subsidizing the cost or forgiving student loan debt is going to solve the fundamental problems, which it's not, because it's actually going to make them worse if colleges are of the mindset that they can charge whatever they want for tuition, and eventually the student's going to have their debt forgiven anyway. There's no real consequence to taking out the debt. Then what would stop them from justifying just raising tuition even further when they know there's going to be a safety net at the other side for the student? And same thing with the student. If they know that eventually they're going to get their debt forgiven, what would stop them from saying, actually, that's a predatory loan, and maybe I shouldn't take that out because it's not in the best interest of my future? And then I would argue, from an even more basic standpoint, outside of all of the funding structures and all of that, we have to ask really important questions about the value of college and whether or not it is even worth it for most people to go to college. I think one of the worst things we did as a society was suggesting that everyone had to go to college to be successful. And it's no wonder we see this massive inflationary effect on college campuses combined with federal subsidies. Those two things, I think, are the biggest drivers of why we're in this place right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people, seemingly including both of us, are somewhat cynical about some of the growth of the college industry, because to the point about everyone needing to have a college degree, which in fact they don't need to have, but the mentality that they need to have that has created degrees and courses that cost a significant amount of money to do, and then burden people with debt that is actually very difficult to get out from underneath. The other point where we may, I think, differ a bit more in terms of at least the tone of it, is that I wonder the cost of college in the United States has become so vast that I worry it pressures people into doing courses that are very vocational in nature and with the promise of payoff, against what was once seen as the classic liberal arts education, which was an education intended to encourage critical thinking, among other things, and critical thinking about society and all of that. The fact that there's not so much money in that when the bill is so high, I think is problematic in an unhealthy way.
Yeah, and I would say that one of the issues I see with college is that those liberal arts classes, which are typically a part of a general education requirement anyway, are not focused on critical thinking anymore. A lot of them have become very politicized by liberal academics, which is another part of the problem. I mean, when I'm hiring interns or people to work at my company, not my company, I don't own it, but I work there, and I hire interns and staff and things like that, I don't see the ability to bring problems with a solution. It's just they bring the problem, and they don't know how to go about solving it without direct hand-holding, which I think is obviously a huge problem for any employer nowadays. So yeah, I mean, they've completely gone away from their traditional purpose, and if colleges are going to be about a more vocational track and getting people into a high-paying career, then there needs to be some kind of recognition that people who aren't doing those tracks shouldn't be taking out $200,000, $300,000 in student loan debt and expecting taxpayer forgiveness. Right,
no, absolutely. And just to finally endorse your point, I mean, one of the things that sometimes makes me feel old is that I remember my own college education being all about the idea that one has competing or different points of view, and one argues those in good faith, and it strengthens both people's argument, and you may or may not come to an agreement, but that process in itself is useful. It seems to me, from what I read and hear, that fundamental ethos has been eroded in a damaging way.
Can confirm. I lived it.
Fair enough. Some more topics to talk about on Rising right after this. Changes are coming to the popular YouTube talk show, Hot Ones.
Media company BuzzFeed announced a deal to sell the studio behind the show, with the sale clocking in at $82.5 million. Buyers include, oh boy, Soros Fund Management.
Yeah, I kind of cleared my throat before this one, too.
Yeah? Maybe this will clear our throats for us.
Yep, and everything else.
Hot Ones debuted in 2015 and has made a name for itself interviewing high-profile celebrities while eating progressively spicier chicken wings. Big shot interviewees include Jennifer Lawrence, Paul Rudd, Post Malone, Margot Robbie and more. The show, get this, has garnered billions of views and has 14 million subscribers on YouTube.
BuzzFeed is reportedly $124 million in debt and sold Hot Ones in an attempt to pay back the owed money this month. The sale comes as the media industry has undergone some other major changes. A bankruptcy judge recently rejected the sale of Alex Jones's InfoWars to satire news site The Onion.
And people on social media are pointing out the unique circumstances of the situation. One ex-user writing, quote, "BuzzFeed survives by selling Hot Ones to George Soros. This is a real headline, not Mad Libs or AI slop." AI slop. We want more of that phraseology around. So I don't know. I mean, I am not a big Hot Ones viewer. Are you? Do you like that show?
I've seen
Amber,
a few episodes. I watch the ones with a celebrity I'm interested in,
Sure.
but I'm not a, dyed-in-the-wool subscriber, watch every episode kind of person.
Are you worried as a conservative that George Soros is about to buy a chicken wing producing
I guess
talk show?
I would only have a problem with it if they decide to make the show political at all, because one of the nice things about it now is that it is not political. They do not interview politicians. In fact, Stephanie Cutter, one of the advisors to the Kamala Harris campaign, said in that Pod Save America interview, the autopsy of the Kamala campaign, that they wanted her to appear on Hot Ones and were rejected because they don't wade into politics. And I think the host has talked about that position further in depth in the past, particularly the 2020 election. I note that there are a lot of buyers behind this, not just the Soros Fund. The host himself, Sean Evans, was also involved in the process and put some money down to become the chief creative officer. And I think there's 2 or 3 other groups involved too. So I'm hopeful that it won't ruin the show. But if it does, I don't really. I'm not a huge super fan.
Sure.
But I wonder, just conspiratorially, if this is not part of the larger plan from some people on the left to kind of create their version of Joe Rogan.
Well, possibly. I mean, to that point, it is interesting, the Kamala Harris issue, they were genuinely disappointed that they couldn't get on because they thought, not only because it has a very big audience, but it's, the vice president is very fond of exhibiting her love for cooking and food and all of that. They felt it was one of the comparatively few more informal media opportunities that was available to them, and then it ceased to be available. They were rejected from it, as you said, on the basis that the show doesn't do politics. It could be that there is an attempt to get those more well, there's definitely an idea that the left needs more of those kind of Joe Rogan type people. And of course, Kamala Harris declined to go on Rogan's podcast during the run up to the campaign. I'm just kind of reluctant to. George Soros has become such a sort of bogeyman for cultural conservatives, and everything that he or his investment fund get involved in is seen as a sort of drive toward liberal political chicanery of some kind. Whereas in fact, maybe he just wants a share of those 14 million YouTube subscribers and a potentially many more years of lucrative eating of hot chicken wings.
It does seem like BuzzFeed and all of its parts are going to be sold for scrap. I mean, in addition to this, they recently closed their news division in the past few years, and Vivek Ramaswamy, of all people, is apparently making a bid to buy the whole thing, as they've been struggling recently with making money, which is a pretty fundamental thing in a business. And just as part of a larger commentary about the media and the state of news as well, I mean, it's not just BuzzFeed News, but places like CNN and Vice and other big outlets have been laying off staffers over the past year to year and a half. The Washington Post was a part of this as well. So they're not going to be alone, I think, in maybe having to offload some valuable assets to keep things afloat. It's a legitimate concern through a lot of media companies that things are not going well, and they don't seem to be supplying the right answers for how to make things go better.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely a fair point. And to the point about BuzzFeed specifically, it now seems to be joining a fairly long list of companies that were once sort of heralded as these champions of a brave new world of one kind or another, that were going to be the new wave of media behemoths who would ultimately sort of take the place of bigger legacy media organizations. And what we now see is legacy media organizations and these supposed pioneers all getting into difficulty. Vice was another one of those companies, as you remember, that at one time was seen as like it's going to change everything, and it has figured the digital age out for media companies, and that proved not to be the case, because if you're running a business and you're spending more money than you're taking in, that tends to end badly at some time.
Yeah, and Ben Smith, the head of the news department for a long time at BuzzFeed, who was supposed to be heralding these changes, was behind the decision to publish the full Steele dossier, which had been unverified at the time, but was being briefed to Obama and Trump and other members of the Obama administration as a potential threat from the Russians. They were sued for it, but ultimately prevailed in court. But Ben Smith ultimately left for legacy media, right? He went to the New York Times to become an internal media critic. So I think with him leaving and going to the exact competitor that they were trying to take out through their news division, that was sort of a really big symbol that things were not going as well as they would have hoped, and their model was not successful.
Yeah, I was very critical of the decision to publish the Steele dossier. More broadly, I would say when BuzzFeed had that bigger actual newsroom, they did do some good work at times as well, and they did some good work on Capitol Hill, and they did some good work that was really getting into, you know, more meaty topics. But ultimately, it seems like they never found a business model that could sustain that despite all the talk of it, and that's unfortunate.
I think probably a big part of it is not really knowing who your audience is, because when you have one side of your website that puts together cat listicles and the other site that's trying to do hard breaking news, how do you square those two sides of the aisle? And I'm not sure that you can.
I'm not sure you can. And then there's the whole issue of brand identity and how you sell them to advertisers and all that. It gets very complicated. Perhaps Hot Ones will figure it out in their new iteration. They certainly have the audience to do it. So
let's put George Soros himself on Hot Ones.
That would
see
be
if he can handle the wings.
Literally break the internet.
Yes, exactly. All right, that's going to do it for us today on Rising. As always, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.